Emerson's most dangerous discovery was not about spiritual transcendence. It was about people who see truths that others can't see, and why this ability destroys them. In his rehearsals and lectures, Emerson documented individuals with what he called different intuitive perception. People who could read the real intentions behind the words, feel hidden emotions, and perceive standards of authenticity that escaped everyone else. They saw through social masks, detected falsehood instantly, and felt the unadvised tensions in each environment. Emerson called this dangerous discovery because these people consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships, not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything had a psychological cost that no one understood. Today, I will show you the most dangerous discovery of Emerson about people who see beyond the ordinary, and why he believed that this rare ability or destroys you or transforms you into something extraordinary. The case that revealed Emerson's most dangerous discovery began with a student he described in his private notes, a highly introspective and intuitive young man who sought him in 1836, during the period when Emerson developed his philosophy of radical individualism. This student, representing what Emerson would later categorize as the most rare type of human personality, had what he called unfall intuitive perception. He could enter any room and immediately feel the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional suffering? Who kept secret resentment? Emerson wrote, "The student demonstrates an extraordinary ability to perceive hidden content in others, but this faculty seems to cause considerable anguish rather than an advantage." He could not get involved in superficial conversations because he saw through each social facade. He could not maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around them. He could not keep jobs because his presence disturbed the unconscious collective agreements that keep the groups working. Emerson realized that he was not dealing with pathology. He was observing what happens when intuition becomes too conscious, when perception becomes too different for social survival. He documented the young man describing people with scary accuracy. He speaks of others as if he had access to his private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I check their observations through careful questions, they are remarkably accurate. This was not psychosis or delirium. It was such advanced consciousness that it had become socially dangerous. But Emerson discovered something even more disturbing, because this student's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain rationally. If you have already identified with this description, leave your like here and subscribe to the channel, because we will further delve into this revolutionary discovery of Emerson. Therefore, Emerson began to investigate what he would later call mystical participation, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overloaded by unconscious contents of others. Emerson wrote in his annotations of the period, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not only conscious communications, but the whole unconscious atmosphere of their environment." Dr. Elaine Aron's modern research on highly sensitive people validate Emerson's initial observations. Your research shows that about 20% of people have high sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Emerson has identified something more specific within his psychological typology, the introvert intuitive type, comprising about 1% of the population, which not only feels deeply but perceives unconscious patterns with frightening clarity. Emerson noted that these individuals have what they called differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not only obvious social signals, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They feel desperation under confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Emerson wrote, "Danger does not reside in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When someone clearly sees what others cannot or do not want to see, it becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look." This creates what Emerson called the problem of superior function, when his greatest strength becomes his greatest burden because he separates you from collective unconscious participation. But Emerson found that the real danger was not the perception itself, because people with highly differentiated perception clearly see the unconscious contents of others. Therefore, they become targets of what Emerson extensively documented as a shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them by reflecting what they refuse to recognize in themselves. Emerson wrote in Nature, "There is nothing more psychologically influence on their environment, and especially in their children, than unpaid life from their parents. But he found that this principle extended to all relationships. When someone's shadow is reflected back through someone else's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrating the shadow or attacking the mirror. Emerson has documented this pattern repeatedly in his philosophical work. The person who clearly sees is guilty of creating the problems he is just observing. His students with different intuition experienced this constantly. When they gently suggested that someone seemed disturbed, that person exploded against them because they are negative or create drama. When they expressed concern about obvious problems, they were accused of being critical or making questions where no existed. Emerson realized that this was not a coincidence. It was psychological defense. In Self-Confidence he wrote, "Everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But for most people, it is easier to attack the person who reflects his shadow than examining what is being reflected. This creates what Emerson called the phenomenon of the scapegoat. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in each group that enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Emerson noted, "The bearer of the superior perception becomes the repository for everything the group cannot consciously recognize about itself." This pattern explains why these individuals not only feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force that cannot explain rationally. But Emerson's most disturbing discovery was yet to come, because Emerson noted that overwhelming perception manifested itself differently in different individuals. Therefore, he identified 4 distinct patterns within the introvert intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents of others. Type 1, the sentimental intuitive. Emerson documented students who combined introvert intuition with different sentimental function. These individuals not only see what is happening psychologically, they feel in their own bodies. They absorb the emotions of others so completely that they cannot distinguish between their own feelings and those who have unconsciously absorbed. Emerson wrote, "The sentimental intuitive lives in a perpetual state of emotional contagion, experiencing the unvived emotions of everyone in their environment." Type 2, the thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral results with scary accuracy. Emerson noted that they were able to predict relationship failures, career disasters, and personal collapses months before they occur, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious recognition of standards. Emerson noticed they have a strange ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others still can't see. Type 3, the sensory intuitive. Emerson documented students who could feel the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting disease before symptoms appeared, feeling fatigue before it was recognized, or realizing the body tension that indicated emotional anguish. Emerson wrote, "These individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical diseases in their environment." Type 4, the pure intuitive. The rarest type Emerson found combined introvert intuition with what he called unlike auxiliary function. They saw everything, but they had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions consistently. Emerson noted, they live in a perpetual state of overload, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without proper psychological structure to process it constructively. Understanding its specific pattern is crucial, because each type requires different approaches to what Emerson called the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why Emerson considered this discovery so dangerous. Because Emerson observed the devastating effects of unlike perception on his students. Therefore, he concluded that seeing everything without appropriate psychological integration represented genuine dangers for both individual and collective well-being. Emerson identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1, rupture of the collective unconscious. Emerson wrote, "The individual who perceives with excessive clarity threatens the collective agreements on which social cohesion depends. When one sees through the shared illusions that keep the groups together, the unknown agreements to ignore certain truths becomes a destabilizing force." Emerson noted that organizations, families, and societies work partially through collective unconscious agreements on what will be and will not be recognized. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements, simply existing authentically. Danger 2, psychological isolation. Emerson documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of the superior function. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, he wrote, the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not have it. The individual becomes an island of consciousness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation is not only social, it is existential. These individuals often report feeling as if they are living in a reality other than everyone around them. Danger 3. Dissolution of identity. More dangerously, Emerson found that people who absorb unconscious content of others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they cannot distinguish between their own inner world and what they are absorbing from their environment. Leave in the comments the word transcendence if you have experienced this experience of absorbing others' emotions to the point of not being able to distinguish what is yours from what it is not. I want to know how many of you identify with this description of Emerson. Emerson called this mystical participation, a state where psychological borders dissolve and the individual fuses with collective unconscious content. He wrote, the danger is not just social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. This is why Emerson considered the integration of higher perception not only therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent, because unintegrated higher perception represented such dangers. Therefore, Emerson developed what he called an individualization process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious content. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. Emerson taught his highly perceptual students to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that was not theirs. He called it conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Emerson wrote, the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. Technical, Emerson instructed students to spend time in solitude complete daily, allowing absorbed material to be sought so that they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2. Shadow integration. Emerson found that people who see the shadows of others clearly often do this because they have not integrated their own. The more you denied your own ability to disappoint, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you will see these qualities in others. Emerson wrote, everything that pisses us into others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inside rather than staying out. Shadow integration means recognizing that you contain all human quality you observe in others. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Emerson called conscious participation in the collective unconscious. The ability to get involved with psychological contents of others without being overwhelmed or losing their individual identity. Emerson wrote, the individualized person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing his own psychological integrity. This requires developing what Emerson called psychological containers, the ability to hold unconscious content of others temporarily as long as they are aware that they are not their own. Because Emerson realized that superior perception or destroys or transforms individuals. Therefore, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological collapse. Thoreau's case, not integrated perception. Emerson was deeply influenced by Thoreau's philosophy, but observed how his superior perception eventually led to extreme psychological isolation. In Nature, Emerson wrote about Thoreau's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Emerson noticed that Thoreau never learned to integrate these perceptions constructively. Instead of using his perception at the service of healing, he wields her as a weapon against society. Emerson wrote, Thoreau had an extraordinary perception of human nature, but remained identified with its superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. Emerson noted that the isolation of Thoreau and eventual collapse represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what he sees instead of transformed for it. Margaret Fuller's case, successful integration. Emerson ostensibly studied transcendentalist Margaret Fuller who considered an example of successful, superior perception. Fuller had what Emerson called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Thoreau, Fuller channeled his perceptions in compassionate service. Emerson wrote, "Fuller turned his superior perception into wisdom that he could nourish others without overloading them. She saw clearly but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance." Emerson noted that Fuller's success came from what he called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Emerson's Integration Day. More significantly, Emerson documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with nature from 1832 to 1836, recorded in Nature. Emerson wrote, "I was threatened by a spiritual crisis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with students." His superior perception of unconscious content, both his own and others, almost destroyed him until he learned to integrate these experiences consciously. Emerson's breakthrough came when he realized that his overwhelming perceptions were not pathological but evolutionary. They represented conscience trying to evolve beyond current collective limitations. This perception transformed its approach with students with similar gifts, because individuals with superior perception often face isolation. Therefore, Emerson emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of getting involved with differentiated conscience without defensive. Emerson wrote in Self-Confidence, "The privilege of a life is to become who you truly is, but this privilege cannot be done in isolation. It requires witness to those capable of recognizing authenticity." Emerson identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1. Individualized people. Emerson wrote, "The individualized person recognizes another individualized person immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be manufactured. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize yourself as members of what Emerson called conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With individualized companions, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them." Type 2. Those engaged in individualization. Emerson noted that actively engaged people in their own process of individualization, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice, often can deal with superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess them themselves, but they understand their value. Emerson wrote, "Those who started to know each other can be able to be known to others." Type 3. Natural containers. Emerson has identified individuals who, although they have no superior perception themselves, have what they called the natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. They can be mature individuals who have faced significant challenges in life. The recognition process. Emerson has developed specific indicators to identify safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about their observations instead of immediately defending themselves against them. They can recognize their own contradictions and limitations without shame, demonstrate what Emerson called psychological mindset, interests in inner reality. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths, show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Gradual revelation protocol. Emerson taught a careful process to reveal perceptual skills. A. Start with small and kind observations. 2. Note their response pattern to feedback. 3. Evaluate if they are defensive or curious. 4. Gradually increase depth based on the capacity demonstrated. 5. Always framed perceptions as offerings rather than pronouncements. Emerson emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but finding people who can get involved with their perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to your self-image, because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development. Therefore, Emerson saw successful individualization as essential not only for personal well-being, but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Emerson wrote in The Academic American, "The individual has always been the bearer of the living spirit, the one who brings change in society." He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception became what he called culture bearers, people who helped consciousness evolve. The 4 stages of transformation. Stage 1. Recognition without overload. The first transformation occurs when you learn to recognize your perceived skills without being crushed by them. Emerson called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. Emerson wrote, "The beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what it really is, not what one wants to be or fear." Stage 2. Integration without isolation. The second stage involves learning to use its constructively perception while maintaining significant relationships. Emerson called this social individualization, to become authentically yourself while staying connected to others. Emerson noted, "The individualized person does not withdraw from the world, but get involved with him more consciously." Stage 3. Service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer instead of a burden. Emerson called this conscious participation. Use their skills at the service of others without running out. Emerson wrote, "The privilege of a life is to become who you truly are, and then offer this authentic self in the service of the whole." Stage 4. Legacy without attachment. The final stage involves what Emerson called transcendent function. Use their perception to contribute to the evolution of collective consciousness without attachment to whether others recognize or accept their contributions. Emerson noted, "The individualized person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present." Integration becomes cultural medicine. Emerson believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perceptions serve vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to recognize, helping to prepare humanity for necessary development steps. Emerson wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as a destination." Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help to make unconscious content conscious before they manifest themselves destructively in collective behavior. But Emerson warned of specific traps that can derail this transformation, because the way of integrating higher perception contains specific dangers. Therefore, Emerson has documented the most common ways that individuals discharge their own process of transformation. Trap 1. The inflation trap. Emerson wrote extensively about psychological inflation, when individuals identify with their superior function rather than consciously integrate it. In circles, he warned, the danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual of human relationships. Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what Emerson called prophetic complex, believing that they should save everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching, judgment, and eventual isolation. Emerson noted, "The moment someone believes to be a carrier of absolute truth, he fell into the trap of unconscious possession by the same forces he seeks to understand." Trap 2. The justification of the withdrawal. Emerson documented cases where individuals used their higher perception to justify complete withdrawal from society. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to enforce engagement, which Emerson recognized as spiritual superiority disguising the wisdom. Emerson wrote, "True individualization requires engagement with the unconscious world. I do not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but was defeated by her." Trap 3. The helper's addiction. Emerson noted that some highly perceptive individuals are addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their ability to see and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Emerson warned, "When perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function." This is not individualization, but his opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role. Trap 4. The return of overload. Even successfully integrated individuals can regress during stress, trauma, or large life transitions. They stop maintaining psychological borders and are flooded with unconscious content from others again. Emerson emphasized, "Integration is not permanent achievement, but dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention." The maintenance of integration. Emerson has developed continuous practices to maintain healthy integration. Regular solitude to distinguish their own psychological contents from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom I engage perceptual skills. Continuous shadow work to prevent projection of their own unconscious content. Connection with others capable of providing reality and support, verification. Creative expression as output for overwhelming perceptual input. Emerson wrote, "The integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with his own psychological complexity." If this content is making sense to you, be sure to subscribe to the channel, Save this video to watch again from here 7 days. You will capture insights you have lost today, and share it with someone who needs to understand that it is not defective to see beyond the ordinary. Because Emerson understood superior perception within the context of collective psychological development. Therefore, he saw highly perceptive individuals as serving essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Transcendentalist, Emerson wrote, "The individual has always been the bearer of the living spirit, the one who brings change in society." He believed that people with superior perception serve as what he called pioneers of consciousness, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. The historical pattern. Emerson noted that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before the collective consciousness was ready to integrate their perceptions. They served as advanced scouts to psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. Emerson wrote, "What appears in the individual first as a psychological perception then manifests itself in the collective as a cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for experiments of consciousness that will eventually benefit the whole." Modern manifestations. Emerson believed that in the modern age, highly perceptive individuals could be feeling psychological patterns that explain collective behavior, environmental and social unsustainability before becoming obvious, spiritual possibilities besides current religious structures, technological implications that others did not consider, contents of the collective shadow that need conscious integration. Emerson's perception. The sensitive individual feels collective problems first and more intensely. His personal symptoms often reflect what all culture needs to address, the service without martyrdom. Emerson's crucial perception was that superior perception serves better evolution when consciously integrated instead of unconsciously suffered. In Representatives of Humanity, he wrote, "The individual who transforms his superior perception into conscious service not only saves from isolation, but becomes a channel through which collective consciousness can evolve naturally." Emerson found that when highly perceptive people learn to integrate their skills without martyrifying, something extraordinary happens. They become what they called living bridges between what humanity is and what can become. But this requires learning the crucial difference between sacrifice and service. The sacrifice arises from identification with suffering. I see too much, so I must carry the weight of all. The service comes from conscious integration. I see clearly, so I can offer this clarity where it is useful. Emerson noted, "The martyr believes that it must suffer to serve. The integrated individual understands that he must be whole to serve effectively. The difference is deep. The martyr runs out because it absorbs everything and sues alone. The integrated person keeps borders conscious, offering perception without taking responsibility for the results." The protocol of conscious service. Emerson developed specific guidelines to transform higher perception into constructive contribution. First, offer observations as gifts, not as obligations. When you see something that can help someone, share it as a possibility, not as an absolute truth they must accept. Second, keep detachment from the results. Your responsibility is to perceive and share when appropriate. Their responsibility is to decide what to do with this information. Third, cultivate what Emerson called detached compassion. Take care deeply without getting lost in care. Emerson wrote, "The integrated person loves without drowning in love, sees without blinding with what he sees, serves without enslaving himself to service." Emerson found that there is a final level of integration where higher perception becomes something that transcends both isolation and overload. He called it transcendent participation, where you become simultaneously completely individual and completely connected. In circles, he described, the individual who reaches definitive integration no longer feels conflict between his superior perception and his humanity. They merge into a unified expression of consciousness. This phase happens when you stop seeing your perception as separation and begins to see it as a bridge. You are no longer the one who sees too much. You are the one who clearly sees and can help others to see too, in their pace. Signs of definitive integration include genuine peace with its perceptual nature. You stop wanting to be normal because you understand that normal is a statistical illusion. Ability to be in any environment without losing their identity or absorbing everything unconsciously. Natural ability to calibrate how much sharing with each person based on their ability to receive. lack of urgency to make others wake up. You trust the natural development rhythms, genuine joy in its uniqueness without arrogance or isolation. Emerson noted, the person who reaches definitive integration becomes a clear mirror that reflects truth without distortion and light without blindness. If you are feeling a real transformation just listening to these words, leave a comment with integration. It helps me to know that this content is really coming to the right people. 3 years after documenting for the first time the case of the young student with unfull intuitive perception, Emerson recorded an extraordinary transformation. In his 1839 notes, he wrote, "The young man who once arrived at me in a state of psychological anguish due to his overwhelming perception, today returned as a living example of successful individualization. What had changed was not the student's perceptual skills. They remained as sharp as soon as possible. What had transformed was his relationship with these skills." Emerson documented, "He no longer feels overwhelmed by what he sees in others because he has learned to see himself with the same clarity. He no longer feels isolated by his perception because he found ways to share it that invite connection rather than creating resistance." The student had learned what Emerson called the alchemy of superior perception, transforming what was once a burden into a gift, isolation into authentic individuality, conscious overload. More significantly, the student had become what Emerson called positive magnetizer, someone whose presence effectively raises the level of consciousness of others through the example, not preaching. Emerson noted, when someone truly integrates his superior perception, he no longer has to explain or defend his perceptions. His integrated life becomes the most convincing demonstration that it is possible to see clearly and yet live with joy. The student had learned the most important truth of all. His superior perception was not defective to be corrected, but evolution to be integrated. Emerson concluded his studies on higher perception with a discovery he considered revolutionary. What society sees as a defect often represents evolutionary advancement. In Self-Confidence, he wrote, "What makes you different may be exactly what the world needs most, but you still don't know it needs it." People with superior perception are not defective. They are pioneers. They are not broken. They are advanced, need not become normal. They need to learn to consciously integrate their exceptional uniqueness. Emerson observed specific pattern. Individuals who initially suffered terribly due to higher perception, when they learned appropriate integration, became some of the most performed and contributing people they knew. They became exceptional therapists because they could feel what their customers needed to heal. Extraordinary artists because they could capture and express truths that others just intuited. Visionary leaders because they could see possibilities that others did not see. Inspiring teachers because they could find each student exactly where they were psychologically. Parents exceptionally tuned because they can perceive and respond to the real needs of their children. Emerson wrote, "Society initially rejects its more evolved elements, but eventually depends on them for guidance when it is ready to grow." If you have gotten here, it means that you probably recognize something about yourself on this journey. You are not defective to see beyond the ordinary. It is not too sensitive, too perceptive, or too conscious. You are evolutionarily advanced. You are feeling what all humanity will eventually need to feel, seeing what all humanity will eventually need to see, understanding what all humanity will eventually need to understand. Your task is not to become less perceptive. Her task is to learn to integrate her perception consciously so that she becomes a bridge instead of barrier, service rather than suffering, contribution rather than isolation. Emerson made it clear, the world needs people who see clearly, especially now, especially you. In the next video, let's deeply dive into something you have probably lived many times: how to identify and survive toxic environments when you are highly sensitive. Because people like you absorb toxicity in ways that others don't even realize, and this can be devastating if you don't know how to protect themselves. I will show the latest discoveries on neuroplasticity and high sensitivity, the signs of environments that literally drain their vital energy, and a specific protocol to protect themselves without isolating. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. This next video can literally save your mental health. Leave in the comments protection if you want to make sure you won't lose this essential continuation. And remember, you don't have to carry the world on your back to contribute to it. Sometimes the biggest contribution is simply to be authentically who you are. Superior perception and everything. Emerson was right. Being yourself in a world that constantly tries to make you something else is the greatest achievement, especially when you see beyond the ordinary. Until the next video.